Thanks for having me back again. It's been really my honor to be back to speak to you. Some of you may remember about 4 weeks ago when I spoke first time, I was mostly talking about different issues about generative AI, about different promises, different challenges, and different needs that we need to explore if we want to kind of consider the overall impact on learning and teaching. But one of the biggest impacts that we felt from the get-go in terms of the generative AI was assessment. Generative AI entered the classrooms, and all of a sudden there was this kind of huge elephant in the room. You may remember last year, this time, most of the institutions around the world were panicking to do something about generative AI because they felt so much threatened about the assessment and what to do. And it was not just related to higher education, but there were many school systems as well around the world because they didn't know what to do. And they thought, well, if we just ban generative AI in our schools, the problem will be solved. And we know that genie is out and we cannot put it back in, and something needs to be done. Some recent research has done the mapping of the existing guidelines and policies that top in the world institutions took to understand the ways how to deal with generative AI in higher education. And you can see that there are generally three themes that emerge in that literature that are mostly talking about academic integrity, advice on assessment design, and then some form of communication with primarily students. We are doing some even more kind of thorough research in which we also found that even your institution has some interesting guidelines, and we try to be a bit more inclusive as well around the world. We're gonna just keep with this type of thing. As you can see here, that most of institutions were primarily concerned with plagiarism, with being honest that you are using generative AI when students are submitting their assignments, and also potentially thinking about the ways how generative AI can be detected or discouraged and so on. And you can see many different institutions around the world were trying to take some of these steps. But what we know from research is that really detecting generative AI produced content is really difficult computational problem. And we don't necessarily have high level of accuracy. There are certain situations and some, if you wish, boundary conditions in which we could have some relatively high level of detection. But my view is, and I think many around the world also hold similar view, is that we don't want to stick our heads into sand, hoping that generative AI may disappear and we can just go back to our all the same business. I had spoken to some colleagues in higher education, also even teachers in schools, and they all stay with a kind of similar belief this is going to go away as much as any hype. This hasn't gone away yet, so we'll see, but I doubt it'll be done. So the other group of the suggestions that many institutions are striving is much more advice on assessment design. And that's really kind of thinking more whether our existing assessments are robust to generative AI, then also trying to really redesign assessment tasks so that we can promote much more creative thinking, incorporating certain authentic elements and contextual elements, and also providing alternative pathways for students to represent their understanding and knowledge. Also thinking about ways how to focus on process and staged assessment design, thinking also about incorporating really generative AI into the assessment process and in-class assessments. And many of these are potentially good ideas in principle, but many people still around the world are struggling how they can potentially take some concrete steps. So really the big question then is for many is how to structure assessment in the age of generative AI. And as some of you know that I come from learning analytics angle, and I'm gonna today mostly talk about the potential promise of learning analytics to address some of these pressing needs in assessment, whether we are talking about higher education or not, and what is the role of learning analytics. So in a nutshell, what I say learning analytics, what I mean, I really mean primarily about using digital data primarily to establish and enhance feedback loops that often don't exist or they are weakened in different classroom settings, especially when we deal with large classrooms or students who are also using different types of technologies, so we cannot directly and easily observe what students are doing. In a nutshell, really learning analytics is not just about collecting data, although it's an important part, but it's really about closing this loop. So by that we mean we want to collect the data about students' interactions with different types of digital technologies, but also with other people, potentially in physical spaces. We want to analyze these type of digital data with a bit of different types of analytic approaches, including generative AI. And then we want to inform the way how we can transform our practice. And that transformation can have different shapes and forms. Some of them could be potentially that we want to have new learning environments, new features, and new technologies. And in other cases, we want to create just changed our teaching practice in many different situations. So specifically, I'm going to focus today on the value of learning analytics for formative assessment in education. And probably some of you remember as well, and some of you who heard me speaking before, I really like to give immediately the key takeaways before I dive into the specifics of my talk. So the first takeaway is that assessment of learning as a process is a key promise of learning analytics. And I'm going to unpack that in detail. The other important takeaway is that analytics enables authentic assessment of a range of different skills that are relevant for the age of AI. And number three, and the final takeaway, is that although analytics can feed back some of that information and insight to the learner or educator, there's this kind of complex link between analytics for assessment and human learning. And not everything is always as rosy as we always have lots of also interesting, promising findings. So now you can sit back, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of promise that we need to think about as we are engaging into learning analytics for assessment in the age of AI. So the key question is how to frame this discourse about the use of learning analytics for assessment in the age of AI. Well, we were quite fortunate to write a paper just about 6 months before the entire hype around generative AI started about the assessment in the age of AI. There was a group of co-authors who anticipated the growing importance of AI in education, and we wanted to kind of make sense of that space and also let the people to frame some discourse. In this specific paper, we primarily also talked about the opportunities that are afforded by the use of AI to improve some of the existing practices in assessment. So we generally identified 5 key opportunities. Number one is that assessment is, as you know, many of us are educators here, is very onerous. So in a way, how to make very onerous task of assessment for educators much more feasible. The other important thing is that assessment is often very discrete. We have really some small, tiny snapshot of the insights into the knowledge or the skill set of the learners. Analytics and AI can help us to have some of that to be much more continuous. Number 3 is something that probably many of you already heard and maybe even experienced, especially those who took different language tests to prove the competency. For example, in English, is that assessments are not necessarily uniform, but they can become much more adaptive. Number 4 is that assessments often are not so authentic, and the use of AI, and we're going to discuss today much more about that, can become much more authentic. And the final thing is that AI is really challenging our understanding of what is the modern skill set and the modern types of skills we need to assess in particular types of situations. So in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to unpack the opportunities of the 4 of these out of 5 that I just mentioned with the light of the use of learning analytics. I'm not going to discuss much about uniform and adaptive type of assessment because many of you have heard of that and analytics in a way, and that's something that's been around for almost 40 or 50 years. So what is the possibility that learning analytics can offer us in terms of visible type of assessment? We've seen that different types of automated methods can provide good high level of reliability in automated scoring of essays, short answers, and can also go on into even other types of artifacts. We're even seeing when we are talking about the writing forms that we are getting really high level of reliability in automated analysis of different types of rhetorical structures that are relevant for different types of genre of writing. So for example, we work in automated the processes of our students of law when they are writing case notes, or when they are asked to write different types of argumentative essays, or when they are asked to demonstrate that they are actually doing some form of transformation of the knowledge based on the resources that they found that knowledge in to something that they are actually integrating and changing. So there could be many different types of rhetorical structures that could be used depending on the types of genre. But that's fine, and the scoring is fine and interesting, but what is also, to me, much more interesting is how we can go beyond just that reliability. And this is the piece of work in which we actually try to demonstrate how students at different levels of skills are actually offering different types of connections between different types of rhetorical structures. What you are specifically seeing here, it's called epistemic network analysis, and it's comparing the students who have high level of performance, mid level of performance, and low level performance on essays. And specifically, we looked into the rhetorical structures of the students in which they were asked to integrate information from different source documents that we curated for that. So you can see that in one of these cases, that the learners who were generally highly performing, they actually had lots of this creation of new insights and also evaluated different sources by connecting it also to certain information that they remembered from the original documents. However, the learners who were not really so good at performing on this very task, they mostly try to remember that information and maybe a little bit to apply. So in a way, they really did not engage into the deeper cognitive processes and demonstrated stronger level of synthesis of the information sources that they were working on. But these type of interesting classifications of the rhetorical structures can also be turned into feedback. And this is the platform we've been developing for the last several years. It's called Flora. It supports self-regulated learning on different reading and writing tasks. And in this specific example, what I'm showing here, this is one of the tools is where learners are writing. We, for them, are also labeling the sentences that they are writing based on the level of the integration of their information. And specifically, we are following Bloom's taxonomy underneath, automatically processing the analysis of these sentences. In early days, we were using some previous versions of the large language models, which one of them is called BERT. In more recent versions, we are using GPT-4. And students are getting immediate feedback about how they are tracking with respect to the integration of their knowledge as that is required in a particular task. And we have multiple other coding schemes that are following different types of rhetorical structures. Number 2 is the continuous assessment. And I'm also using a little bit of a play of the words here that process measurement is the dark side of assessment in a similar way as we have the far side of the moon or Pink Floyd's the dark side of the moon, but in a way that the process measurement is heavily underutilized and even more so underexplored in the literature, in assessment, and more importantly, also in practice. So why we think the use of analytics can offer us and unlock this black box of process measurement in the assessment for the age of AI. I'm returning back again to the Flora environment. I'm of the view that in certain age groups, and especially as we are growing and focusing on higher education, that we need to encourage the use of certain sophisticated AI tools, because that's what is going to happen in reality. So this is one of our, again, extensions of our Flora environment, in which we also embedded directly the use of ChatGPT through the API. So students can write on their essay, and then they can immediately ask ChatGPT, can you give me advice how to improve the essay? But underneath, we are also passing the content of that essay along with the description of the rubric into the prompt that is sent to the ChatGPT, also by asking ChatGPT not to generate text for the learners and replace the essay. And it can offer interesting feedback for the learners. But as analytics is collecting all these interactions, clicks, keystrokes, mouse movements, even if we allow students to copy and generate that text, we will know all that information. We can track that. So where is the then value of analytics? As we are collecting these low levels of data about students' interactions, uses of ChatGPT, artifacts they are producing, etc., we can then, and we spend a lot of time thinking about these type of things, can map these, we call this raw traces about students' interactions with different types of technologies into something that represents the processes of learning. In our case, we spend a lot of time measuring, for example, self-regulated learning, collaborative learning and collaborative problem solving. We also focus a fair bit of teamwork, etc., in different types of environments. This is just one example how we are measuring different cognitive and metacognitive processes. So then the valid question can be on your side is, well, Dragan, this is fine, but how does it matter? I mean, you are just collecting some traces and that you can just now count students' clicks or potentially count the number of processes. Here's why I think this is really very important. Last year, we published this study in which we basically created a predictive model of the students' essay scores, in which we trained the model based on two types of features or two types of variables, if you wish. Some of them were primarily about the properties of the students' artifacts. For example, what was the coherence of these documents and so on. And the other one was much more focused on the time students spend on different processes of their cognition and metacognition. And you can see here that these green bars represent the process measures of students' learning. And you can see that altogether they explain more variance in the outcome that we were actually looking into than the artifact types of measures. So in a way that tells us if we focus much more on the process, we actually are getting much deeper insight how students are doing. We are getting quite predictive about the actual artifacts that they are generating. And more interestingly, we can then feed students some information back about how they can improve their processes. So inside of our Flora environment, we are observing underneath with the analytics these type of processes. We are sensing them. And then over time, we send certain types of prompts to the learners. This is one of our, what I call old school AI prompts, where we are kind of knowledge engineer lots of different rules, how students can be triggered and prompted, and then also provided with some of the types of insights. And then students can create a checklist of the actions that we are suggesting them to take. However, More recently, we are also generating much more human-like text by feeding our insights from the analytics, whatever we are processing underneath, onto the GPT and ChatGPT, if you wish. So that students can get a very human-like feedback in a form of a scaffold. So we say to them that they made a good start, but remember to regularly refer back to the task instruction to ensure you're on track, and so on. We give them really very specific type of human type of interactions, and they can now start conversing with the bot as well about how potentially, what does it mean, how they can improve some of these things, and so on. But what is really interesting and cool thing about the generative AI technology is that we can easily support many different languages. So this is, who can guess which language this is? This is Finnish. We also are experimenting with Spanish, with Mandarin, with Portuguese, and soon also we'll start working with Arabic as well. So the environment can easily support relatively inexpensively different types of languages to establish this interface of the chatbot that is actually built up on top of the analytics that we are doing. We are still investigating many different opportunities because the chatbot itself is making lots of decisions on its own on top of some of the things that we are using to prompt it. The third point I want to talk about the assessment is generative AI, analytics, and authentic assessment. The key idea is for analytics for authentic assessment is to offer measurement of when and where learning happens. I'm going to mention two types of things that we are looking here about authentic assessment and two specific examples. One is something that is very contemporary, what we are doing, and some of you may remember I spoke about this when I visited in October about the kind of healthcare professions assessments that we are doing in the simulation-based learning. And the other one is 4 or 5 year old work that is more related to virtual internships that was done by one of the faculty members in our group while still doing their PhD at the University of Wisconsin. So I'm going to start first with the virtual internships. The idea was conceived by David Schaefer at the University of Wisconsin. Virtual internships means that students are asked to be immersed into very authentic types of tasks. For example, they are deployed into an engineering organization. They need to engage with different stakeholders. They also need to use different domain-specific tools when they are conversing with different stakeholders. That can be done through chats, or it can be done through emails, responses, and these stakeholders could be either computer agents or could be other humans that are part of the process. It's been shown to be exceptionally immersive. When David conceived this idea almost 10 years ago, they wanted to get the best students in some of the schools, grade 12, etc. But the school just gave them the students who were in detention. And they found students, once they entered the room, when students were working on this, the room was completely silent because everybody was completely immersed into the process. So it can be really engaging. But from the perspective of the analytics, what can be done is that we can automatically analyze traces of different types of processes, as I just discussed, inside of the chats students do. We can also analyze how students are effectively using some of the tools. And this is the example of one of the interfaces for the teachers that are provided based on this type of analysis. This is a very simplified version of the epistemic network analysis that is trying to indicate what kind of balance students are making or what kind of trade-offs students are making when they are making decisions about some of the, for example, design thinking processes and the tasks that they are asked inside of these virtual internships. So they can basically use different types of models. You can use different types of indicators to make the justifications or engage with different types of stakeholders. But what is really neat is that we can also get very specific recommendations for the teacher. Similarly, for the learners, what else could be done by making inferences based on these analytics that are shown in the epistemic network model And similarly, we can even send that back to the learners through the use of GPT type of technology. So obviously, this was done when creating this type of virtual internship required months and months of the work so that we can effectively analyze these texts, provide messages back and forth. Today with generative AI, it's so much faster. And when it's also coupled with analytics to track some of these interactions and also analyze different types of artifacts, we can feed that information back in real time and create this very immersive virtual experience. The other one is more physical type of environment in which we are asking learners to really work on a simulation. They are asked in that process to work with each other, also to identify a patient who is rapidly deteriorating. The learners also need to deal with the actors whose primary role is to make their lives miserable during this simulation. Also to know and recognize the situation when to invite other nurses to help them who are not at the moment in the ward that they are being simulating, and also potentially physicians to help them. To do that, we are using different types of sensors. We use different types of localization sensors so that we know their exact indoor position, and based on that we can make inferences whether they are collaborating or individually working on the tasks, and or whether they are on the primary task, that is the patient that is rapidly deteriorating or dealing with something else. We can also collect the data about their speech through the microphones. We can also record video the entire room. We even developed small apps for the instructors who are observing from the outside what kind of things that students are doing and identifying critical moments that are used then as annotations to the video, so that they are, when they are back to the debrief room, they get these analytics. For every critical moment, they get analytics, how they are using space, how much they were interacting with each other, whether there was a dominant node in the process, and also how they were using the language as a part of the teamwork, how well they were conversing with each other with something like that. We started also experimenting, and that's really an interesting thing, is that we identify for each of these critical moments, we generate data comics as well. And that's done with the Midjourney, one of those data to image type of technologies that is allowing us then to actually tell them a whole story, what happened. We found that some learners in higher education, nursing students love it, typically early years, year one. However, later years of the nurses found it a little bit juvenile, meaning that could be a bit childish. So in a way, there's some potential sweet spot how we don't have to use analytics to become a bunch of charts, but it can become a bunch of stories that learners can engage without necessarily having very high level of data literacy. The final type of things I'm going to talk about, the promise of the analytics, is really to think about what skills we should measure. What are those type of things that we need to have in mind when we are measuring with respect to the generative AI? And in that sense, we published last year one study in which we looked at the reflection essays that students are producing in one of our top programs at Monash University in pharmacy. It's basically 3 times a year, and then we generated those with different types of strategies with ChatGPT. You can see based on these results that ChatGPT can beat students really badly. So the big question is, do we want our students to produce these essays just without the technology, or we want to use the technology itself? If we are using generative AI, the big task for us is to think about is how we redefine the skills. We need to rescope the definition of what we need, for example, for human AI problem solving, to move it from the just traditional definition of the collaborative problem solving. Similar goes for self-regulated learning, to think about hybrid human AI regulation. how is that done, how that can be done and measured. We already see quite a bit of a promise, and we just have a new study that is accepted for publication, in which we are using an existing and proven assessment approach, which is called evidence-centered assessment, proposed by Bob Mislevy and used for the last 20 plus years, in which we can assess different types of knowledge or skill types. So in our specific study, we primarily focused about how we can assess students' levels of knowledge transformation with the use of generative AI. And we primarily used a tool which is called Co-Author, developed at Stanford University, to generate a quite large co-author tool where students were together with generative AI, authoring different types of things. And we wanted to see how the quality of the students' cognitive presence as part of that process, as well as the quality of the knowledge transformation, can be measured with the use of the evidence-centered design. And we are actually finding really promising directions as we are developing new ways to do this type of modern assessment. This is with respect to the promise. I want to make a few quick points also about what still needs to be done or what we need to pay attention. One of the big things for any form of assessment is that we have some evidence of validity and reliability of our assessment instruments. Learning analytics was initially conceived to be actually somehow using the accidentally collected data about students' online interactions, clicks, and so on. But we really need to think about much more carefully how that is valid and reliable, and ask a question whether counts of clicks count for learning. What is possible to do that? We so far actually are quite convinced that it can be done and tackled, and we are seeing that there are two strategies that are working really well. One is to actually use more pedagogically valuable, we call it instrumentation tools, meaning that we can get much more granular type of data about students' actual learning types of activities. So for us to support different types of learning and writing or video watching tasks, we actually, for learners, introduce different types of tools. We, for example, allow them to use different types of annotations. These annotations are allowing us to get much more understanding about actual students' intentions behind their viewing and scanning of the pages. But at the same time, the use of these tools is proven to be quite helpful in certain situations, like highlighting or being able to just kind of identify what is an important concept, what is confusing, and so on. And we can immediately latch on that type of insight to provide learners with a certain type of feedback. Similarly, we can also ask students to do the different types of planning as well. It is valuable for learners to engage some level of planning, and for us as well to get that kind of insight how students are planning. Some reality, though, is that we just published one study as well. In a relatively short-term types of tasks, students do not comply with their plans at all. So the question is, even if we want our students to set goals or do the plans, we need to be actually much more proactive for students to occasionally reflect on their plans as well. So that this type of, not only we are interested in the assessment of the students' learning, but equally about continual improving on their learning processes. And the other important thing is that we should not be just depending on the clicks, etc. When we are at least during the tool development stage. I'm not expecting from edgy educator to do this type of things, but for us who are developers of the tools of these type of things, and also vendors who are offering universities some of these type of tools, we want to ask valid questions about how you validated some of your data and some of your assessments that are based on the analytics. In that sense, we are using, as you can see, a range of different types of approaches with the eye tracking, with different types of webcams to understand different affective states. We even used think aloud protocols. We used even different types of physiological sensors on top of some of conventional measures that we are using in learning analytics. But based on that, we are actually able to get very good measures, improved measures, and you don't need your students to use any of that in the actual classroom or you want this type of things. This is what should have happened when the tool was designed and developed before you actually get it inside of some of your practical settings. Number two is, I spoke really highly that AI-powered learning analytics assessments can be really useful and positive, but there's this kind of nuanced, complex relationship between that type of analytics powered with AI assessment and actual human learning. So what we found, for example, in several recent studies is that type of AI-powered analytics assessment can promote improved learning performance. In one of our studies, we found is that, as I previously showed, some of these highlights of the students' essays and so on can significantly, considerably improve students' accuracy of self-assessments. So in a way, students are able to much better judge their own products of writing or learning. So that is really important because that's the most significant way how students can actually improve their own performance. We also found in another study is that AI type of tools as well that we use to empower students with the analytics significantly increase the quality of students' peer feedback. So in a way, when you're creating these type of peer feedback communities, students can profit tremendously. However, we also found some inadvertent side effects that we didn't want to. So for example, for the peer feedback benefits, we found that they start deteriorating when AI-powered assessment is removed. So in a way, that becomes a scaffold, students use it, but they really do not improve their own skills. I think we really need to think about two important things here as the direction. One is how we scaffold these type of AI scaffolds for the students inside of our pedagogical designs when we are introducing some of these type of tools. And number two is that we really need to run more longitudinal types of studies to understand when some of these things should be going on and when it should stop. The other one is also that students become dependent on some of these tools and blame them for the weaknesses in their own learning. So in a way, how we can understand that students still hold the responsibility for their learning while they are still doing some of these things. Final thing I want to speak today about is that we really need to think about responsible policy and practice, because we're talking about lots of these AI technologies that can be biased, they can also do many types of things. One of the potential threats is that they can also restrict the pedagogical role of assessment. So in a way, if you're using some of these type of automated methods just to grade the students, well, what is the role, pedagogical role for students and the teachers to use assessments to improve some of the students' learning? And the other important thing is that we should not be considering that AI-powered analytics is perfect, flawless. It's a kind of a black box of that kind of neutral expertise. We must not sideline that professional expertise, but we need to grow as the learning and teaching communities as well that is embracing some of these technologies, but at the same time we respect and empower human expertise. And on that note, I really hope I offered you a good argument today that learning analytics offers strong potential for novel assessment practices. And number two is that there's this kind of very subtle intricacy of human-AI relationship in analytics for assessment, and we need to invest much more time and efforts to actually tackle it from different types of aspects. So thanks so much for your attention and look forward to some of your questions.
Dragan, I was wondering if you could also take us briefly through a process of how faculty work with you in using this Flora system, as well as implementing this in their assessments or practice.
It's something we've been working on for the last few years. Now, we often really use Flora not only as a kind of set of us who are passionate about education, and it's a very interdisciplinary team of computer scientists and educational psychologists who are working on the Flora tool, but it's also that we are deeply engaging with the faculty members to co-design learning tasks for their learners that would be the most meaningful to leverage the benefits of some of these tools.
Look, one of the key things is for us to not only parachute our technology into the classroom, at least in the initial steps, but to actually co-design some of the tasks or activities for the learners in which some of these technologies can be done most meaningfully. So that co-design often for us so far is done in such a way, not only did it help the faculty members to change some of their tasks and best scaffold the introduction of the tool that we had in mind, but equally so helped us to improve the tool itself so it can best accommodate the students' needs. So that's one of the the key things is where we experience, at least at Monash and often institutions as well, is that when you create this type of innovation, like we create Flora, is where that fits in the institutional pipeline. Often universities have their learning management systems that they guard very carefully. They have reasons, they have cybersecurity reasons, etc. But then that makes really often for us difficulty that we need to ask that sometimes some of these tasks need to be done on a separate instance of Moodle so they can actually experiment with some of these things. Except in our case, Flora is designed in such a way to be a plugin as well to Moodle, so it can be easily deployed into any type of environment. So it's really requiring a little bit of organizational twisting and navigation that goes beyond just the goodwill to develop and have some interesting innovation, goodwill of the faculty members, but also requires institutional support to actually create, if you wish, good playpens where we can actually integrate some of this type of innovation.
I'm really very impressed by the work you've done, and actually, I completely believe that assessing the process is the way to go. As the case was well made that we can never be sure of the product, especially because of the AI co-construction. But as you've kind of alluded to as well, assessment always has a backwash effect. So I'm just wondering whether, based on what you've already looked at, if we focus completely on the process, what could be the potential backwash effect? I'm thinking almost, do we get more diverse product? Or by focusing on the process, we get everyone to be metacognitive, we get everyone to be reflective, we end up with very similar products at the end. I just don't know. Sorry for that poorly framed question, but I hope you know where I'm getting at.
I absolutely. I doubt we'll ever get everybody having similar products, but I think your question is really very valid. My thinking is that we need to, have both things, because at the end of the day, we in education, our responsibility is to help people become better learners, to be better at learning, etc. And for us educators is to become better teachers, right? But ultimately is also that learners need to have certain skills. Learners need to demonstrate they can produce something as well. My argument, and probably something that I could have also potentially provoked more as well explicitly in my talk, is that we probably need to think about better balance in between how we are measuring the process, feeding information back on the process to ultimately improve the quality also of the products as well. Because I don't think we actually want to entirely dismiss the products, except that we are really interested in, especially when students can generate good quality of some of the types of products, but we are still interested in how learners can improve their decision making, how they can improve their judgments, and consequently many types of skills that are important to generate these type of processes that our assessments need to balance the two. What is the right balance? I have no answer to that question. Ask me in a few years.
I think maybe my other question is and I believe you shared a bit about measurements of skills, but how valid or how can we really check in terms of soft skills or even in which that your platform has shared? Is there something you can talk a little more about with regard to skill development and measuring that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hinted here how we are measuring self-regulated learning and teamwork. We similarly also worked on measurement of collaborative problem solving as well in different digital environments. I know several people around the world as well, like David Schaefer, they looked into the way of design thinking, engineering, and computational thinking, and so on. The key thing there is that the process requires that we have clear conceptualization of what kind of skills we want to have. And then for each of these type of concepts of the skills, we need to also think about what kind of tasks learners need to engage so that they can produce, if you wish, the data or the evidence based on which we can have these type of good analytics or good type of assessments for them. That's, in a way, speaking back to some of the existing assessment practices. And I think for all of us, as part of our professional development, is really important to think about and going back to some of these assessment practices, thinking about what is that evidence-centered design that is commonly used in the assessment practice. And that would actually be quite tremendous help as well for us educators, especially if we are interested in doing this type of process assessment in addition to the product assessments and part of the things. So that is hopefully partially addressing some of your question, JY. And I see that we have multiple questions in the chat now.
Could you talk about the potential longitudinal impacts of general AI on learning?
I think that's something really important. It's a big question. We still don't know. I raised my also potential concerns is long-term is what is the impact on students' learning if they are just led to use generative AI for writing? We know how writing is an important learning tool, right? And then the learners are basically completely letting that control over the writing process and the learning process to the external tool. I think in a long term, it will not be ideal outcome. My view is, and that's why I think the process type of assessment is really important for us, is so that learners understand how to balance and exercise their agency with the agency of the AI, so that we actually have the learners who are capable to understand the benefits of the things that generative AI is offering to them, at the same time are capable to understand the weaknesses and also understand how they're upskilling. I think it's an important long-term trajectory for all of us as we are making sense of how we are going as part of this process. But it's really essential for us to think about learners as the agents who should be actually able to make informed decisions about their learning, about their writing, and every other type of a skill.
So the next question from Nisi which is the question on process-based measurement. So what do you think would be some of the challenges and possible directions of solving fairness issues in assessments with generative AI for its cultural validity?
It's a really terrific question. About a year and a half ago, with one of our PhD students, we did a study in which we precisely looked into some of these issues about the fairness of the generative AI to do the different types of assessment or coding tasks of different types of artifacts that students are producing, and similarly processes as well. What we found is we did not necessarily in that study look into the cultural issues. We primarily focused on the self-reported gender of the students, and we limited the gender in that study to only binary type of notion of that, in spite of all the limitations that I understand could be. What we found is that just by the text that we were using, all the artifacts that students were producing, we were able to predict students' gender. So in a way, the generative AI is biased. It's aware of the type of writing styles that different types of genders in this specific case were actually offering. The good news was that we were able to develop the algorithms that could actually completely eliminate these type of biases. So that's one part of its story. I think we require more studies that are specifically looking into this different cultural and contextual issues. I understand as well that even the speech itself and the accents we are using, for example, for you in Singapore, Singlish, may be actually not getting all the benefits of the generative AI if the data sets are trained in different other types of accents. Although, true to be told, some of the new generative AI-based type of tools are getting actually much better and much more nuanced at some of these things as well, especially some of the open AI technologies like Whisper and so on. It's really good at even transcribing different languages, not to say different types of accents. So in a way, I think there are multiple things that we need to do about some of these things. One is the really kind of looking into that fairness as a computational problem that could potentially be minimized. But I'll make a very strong claim here. It will never be eliminated simply because there are biases that exist in the society, and models often are really good at detecting those. Number two is then that we need to also have clear, careful best practices and policies, how we are accounting for some of these things, so that we are not really delegating everything to the technology, but leave also to the human judgment and the negotiations that humans will have with respect to some of these technologies.
This question is, in learning analytics, which institutions, in your knowledge, are the frontiers in terms of research? And could you introduce us a few centers of excellence to watch from your research?
Well, we have really large concentration expertise and everything, and probably we are the largest center of learning analytics at Monash University, with about 50 people who are just in the center specifically working on these type of topics. They are really interesting things. I think at NTU, you are really in a kind of a promising space. You are probably one of the institutions with very few institutions around the world have a specialized learning analytics center. I understand it's relatively early days, but I think you should be very proud that you have the specialized Center for Learning Analytics in that sense. The other one is at the University of South Australia. It's called, I don't know the full name to spell it out, but the abbreviation is C3L, and it's led by Shane Dawson and George Siemens. So they are our sister center, and they're really doing a terrific job. At the University of Pennsylvania, Penn Center for Learning Analytics, led by Ryan Baker, is also one of the really terrific places you want to pay attention to. The Open University in the UK is probably having some of the most interesting institution-wide adoptions of learning analytics, but there are also specific type of institution where everything is online, etc. So it's kind of slightly different types of complexity. The University of Michigan in the past also has done some of the really interesting things. They are not having a specialized learning analytics center, but as part of their relatively large Center for Academic Innovation, they are doing many interesting things. So those would be kind of the places I'd highlight. And then maybe some of the emerging places that are having some interesting things on the boundaries between learning analytics and AI. And generative AI is like an emerging Center for Hybrid Intelligence at the University of Oulu in Finland, and the only national specialized AI lab for education in the Netherlands that is led by Inge Molenaar. Those would be the things and the places that I would highlight.